Welcome to Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello, my name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and critic, and today I'm talking to Jay Glennie. Jay is the author and publisher of a series of beautiful large format books documenting the making of some classic films. The Deer Hunter, Performance, Raging Bull and Trainspotting have all had the treatment, which includes exclusive interviews with the stars and filmmakers and beautiful, often unseen before, photographs. If you like the episode, please remember to like, share and spread the word. You can also follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, ERJONTY. But before you do any of that, please enjoy the conversation.
We came out and we had a fantastic response. They're big, large format editions. It's something that my buddy and I, we set up, Coattails, purely because I took the Deer Hunter idea to a few publishers and they diluted it so much. I believe I'd spoken to Marion Rosenberg, who's the executive producer on Deer Hunter, and she'd given me this huge cachet of post-production material. And Bob and I had met at that stage and he'd offered to open up his archives. I don't think I'd gone. So I knew there was this wealth of material and I didn't want it diluted. And I think we're so used to seeing things on the internet now and on our iPads and such like tablets, we can blow up these images. And I've always found it a little bit frustration when you got these small books and you can't see the images very well. So I really wanted the books to be big, large format editions. And that's what gave birth to this little publishing company. We set it up and we're on our third book release now. Trainspotting comes in the summer, and then by winter we'll have Taxi Driver as well.
How long have you been doing it for? When did you set it up?
Yeah, about 2 years ago.
And your first book was The Deer Hunter then?
No, my first book would have been The Deer Hunter, but Performance came out before that. I sort of paused The Deer Hunter and because Mick Jagger was free, so I ended up interviewing Mick Jagger for Performance, and that came out, and then we got Deer Hunter out, and then when I presented Bob with The Deer Hunter, he came over to London Christmas 19 and he asked what was next. And I said, I'd love to explore Raging Bull. Lockdown happened. I rang him, I texted him and said, look, Bob, I'm going to start now. And he gave me the green light. And so that was my sort of lockdown baby whilst writing Trainspotting as well. Having read Performance and The Raging Bull, it's amazing the amount of people that you have been able to talk to. Yeah, John, stupidly, anybody setting out on a first-hand oral account, I think we need our senses looked at, because in no way would you assume that you could get hold of these people. But I didn't really want to see myself in the book. So that was the first port of call. I really wanted to make sure that the people, main participants were there. But what's really exciting as well is to find people that not many people have interviewed. In the Gloria Norris book, in the Raging Bull book, I found a lady called Gloria Norris, and she transcribed the screenplay that Bob and Marty made their own in St. Martin. And she referred to some images she'd taken. And I asked her, you haven't got your iPhone there, you can just see them. And she sent them through. And those are the images of the guys on the beach in their Hawaiian shirt with the pina coladas. And I'd never seen those images before, so they had to be in the book. And then Bob referred to his training video. So I managed to get some screenshots of his training video. And these things, when you find these things, they're heaven. So those alongside the participants, I just think it's key for those guys to come on board. But you've set yourself up for a fall to believe that they are going to come on board. But when they do, it's a dream. With Raging Bull, I had an email from Bob on the Monday morning. Jay, you free now? I need to talk to you ASAP. And no matter how close you feel you are with somebody or a relationship you built up, that those kind of emails are always a little bit, oh my word, this doesn't sound good. He called and he'd spoken to Joe the night before, and I'd had 3, maybe 4 no's from Joe's people. He doesn't do interviews. And I didn't push, but I just periodically I'd send them an update, just a little nudge, so they could see how the project was growing. And the same answer came back. And then Bob obviously spoke to him and said, look, this guy's quite trustworthy, come on board. And he said yes. And it was a great interview. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I mean, the first couple of, I don't think I'm speaking out of turn now, but the first couple of questions were batted back with a straight bat, almost yes, no, which is obviously not going to translate in a book.
Right.
Instantly, I was thinking on my feet, and I gave him the question and the answer to the next couple of questions. Yeah, that's right. That did happen. Yeah, you're right. And before we knew it, we were almost like you and I now, with conversational, just chatting away, and it was marvelous. His PA ended up bringing me back and saying how much he'd enjoyed it. I mean, to get Pesci on board was just key. And I mean, as you say, you read the book, and his little insights, I think, are wonderful.
Well, exactly, because he's such... I mean, Raging Bull, you've obviously got Martin Scorsese, who's one of the better... I mean, he's one of those directors who's really available to lots of different people, so you can sort of hear his thoughts. I mean, and he writes himself, but someone like Joe Pesci, that's a real... that you hit gold there.
Yes. I mean, through nothing from my side of things. It's all wonderful. Robert De Niro opened up that door. Yeah, there's a quite wonderful quote for Joe in the book. He says, Raging Bull gave me my life, and he's under no doubt that it did, and it certainly gave him his career. I don't know about a life. Both
Pesci and De Niro have reputations as being quite recalcitrant and difficult to interview as well, but you obviously had established a relationship first with Bob De Niro and then afterwards with Joe. How did you first meet and get involved in that way?
It's simply by writing away. I sent an email over to his representatives. It was just laying out who I'd spoken to on The Deer Hunter, what my intentions were, how the book was going to be a celebration. I only wanted to know about the film and its making of. And that I still remember the email coming back in, John, and I actually spoke to the screen. Really? He's going to do it. And it was, his team are going to set you up on a call. We'll give you some dates. Enjoy. And they did. And we did. It was remarkable. I think I've never put makeup on Bob. I've never put a microphone on Bob. I've never put a camera on Bob. I've never put a light on Bob. It's just literally we're sitting there chatting. I then transcribe, I then send it back to him. He then comes back with some thoughts and expands. He's never once censored me. I don't recall. He has... That's a lie, actually. He has on a couple of occasions, because I've made him sound apparently like an English guy.
Right.
I've said something that was fantastic or that was wonderful, and he said, "Jay, I would never say that." I think you're making me sound like you now. And so he's got a little bit of that Essex isms in him initially. When we've managed to take those out. Yeah, he's been nothing but friendly. I mean, I remember when Barry Norman interviewed him, and I think famously sort of walked out. And I've had none of that, Bob. We've got on really well, and he's somebody I consider a friend now, which is. If you'd have told me a couple of years ago, I would have been amazed. If you'd have told the boyhood, Jay, my word. I mean, John, I made my mum buy me silk underpants for school because I heard that he'd worn them in New York. When you go to an Essex comprehensive school and you're getting changed for sports and pin down your shorts to reveal you've got silk underpants on, you need pretty broad shoulders.
That's amazing. But was he then your sort of first point of contact when it came to deciding I want to do a film about I want to do a book about the Deer Hunter? I want to do is he your entry into those movies?
Yeah, more so than the directors. I went, it was instantly Bob. I don't know what it was. What was my first Bob film, Robert De Niro film? Do you know what I think? It was that new wave of British actors that came out when I was younger. So you got Tim Roth, Gary Oldman, and they were referencing him, and almost simultaneously we had the Mickey Rourkes and the Sean Penns in America, and they were referencing Robert De Niro, and that's how I would have got into Robert De Niro. And then I moved backwards, Marlon Brando, Montgomery Clift, and James Dean, much to my wife's disdain now, because we often have an 80s movie night, because I've missed all those 80s films because I was a pompous twit and didn't watch them because they didn't have De Niro or Penn or Dean or Clift in them. So the Back to the Futures I've only just recently seen, all these wonderful films that I thoroughly enjoyed sitting down watching them, but I never got to watch them at the time because I was so I was sort of filling my tanks up with all these wonderful actors.
What got you into the idea of writing film books, and particularly this kind of making of book, which I personally, I absolutely love this kind of book. This is sort of like, there was a TV show, I can't remember what it's called now, but I think it might have been on the ITV, where they showed you behind the scenes of For Your Eyes Only and stuff like that. And I used to eat that stuff up as a kid. It was called Clapperboard or something like that. Okay. But I really love this. I'm the guy who watches all the DVD extras and all that sort of stuff. What drew you to this format?
Very, very similar story, John. As young guys, if we went to the pub to watch the football, I go up to the screen at half time and listen to the half-time commentaries as they reevaluated the first half. My mates would be at the bar and I'd be listening to this because I was so interested in the process. I was always interested in what went behind the scenes, and that was the same thing with movies. I've always been. Hence, at the top of our conversation, I showed you how many film books I've got. It's always that process of how and why is almost as interesting to me as the film itself. I've always been interested. I got into writing TV formats, and I came up with an idea to look at British Oscar winners. We'd only just had our first daughter, and anybody who's got children would know you never wake up mum when we've got a young baby in the house to tell her you've got a great idea for a TV format. Top tip, don't do it. But I'd had a couple of Jack Daniels, it was very late, and I thought, God, that's a good idea. I could look at British Oscar winners. I wonder how many British Oscar winners got. This would be a good idea. And I started writing lists. Cut a long story short, I started interviewing loads of British Oscar winners. Nobody asked me where the interviews were going. I didn't know where they were going. I didn't know they were going to a book, a TV show, whatever they were for. But no one's agents asked. Michael Caine had taught me to cook a fine roast potato, interviewed the Liberty Haviland, all these wonderful people. And not one person asked me what was going with them. The three guys that won the Oscar for The Deer Hunter were three British producers. And their stories were quite full of rancor and bitterness and falling out. And instantly my antennae went up. I thought, well, this is a bigger story than just their interviews. So I started writing away to Deer Hunter participants. And then a friend of mine, Steve Kirkham, had the rights to some images for The Man That Fell to Earth. I said, well, I know the producers of The Man That Fell to Earth, Michael Dealey, Barry Spikins, and John Peveril. How do you know them? And I told him the story. I said, look, well, I could interview them for the book if you want. And then it expanded in. I brought a school friend of mine in, Dal, and we sort of co-wrote this book together on The Man That Fell to Earth. So instantly, when that finished, I thought, well, I could do this similar kind of thing. And we've been interviewed by Jonathan Roth for The Man That Fell to Earth. And when he came out into the green room, he shook hands with everybody and he said to me, you, riding on the coattails of David Bowie, I'll talk to you later. And I remember thinking, coattails publications, that's a great idea. Because all my books are going to be riding on the coattails of somebody. That's what I call the company. That's literally as simple and easy and as naive as it was. I thought I'd set up a little company, sell them on the internet, make them limited edition to create that call to arms to get them quite quick. And a couple of years later, I still haven't had my bathroom decorated, much to my wife's disdain, because I'm piling money into creating books.
Build it and they will come philosophy.
Yeah, I had an older brother. I shared a bedroom with my late older brother, Bob, and he sort of punk was sort of just finishing and the new wave was starting. So it's that sort of punk mentality, really, that I grew up with. We had loads of our school friends were in bands and have since made great careers. And you thought, why not? Why can't I give it a go? Let me give it a go. And if you don't ask, you'll never know. So it's that philosophy, really. Then for The Man That Fell to Earth book, I'd interviewed Nick Rowe. Whilst I was there, I took along some questions, John, and I very rarely have questions when I'm interviewing people. I've done enough research. I know exactly where I want to go, but I'd love to see the conversation grow. An old friend of mine was a journalist, and he told me to have your questions. By all means, have your questions, but your second question, ignore your second question until you know you've finished with the first one, because that first answer could take you on another journey. Too often, people are already asking the second question before the first question's been answered, and you never know where that first question is going to be answered and what journey you're going to take. I broke that little rule. I took a load of questions along for Nick Rowe, and on the first question I asked him, it was probably a half hour. He hadn't answered the question. We were on a completely different tangent. I remember picking the questions up and putting them in my bag, thinking I'm never going to get these answers. And his wife came up with a tray of drinks and she said, Nick, are you behaving yourself? Jay, is he behaving himself? And I sort of looked at her and she could see that I wasn't really getting, and she sort of made him answer the question, because the first thing he said to me actually was, I'm going to apologise for my grasshopper mind. And Nick Rowe, like his film, non-linear, but I've got a grasshopper mind. And I had read that he didn't like talking about performance, but my naivety, not knowing what the rules were, I thought, well, I'm going to ask him. And sure enough, we did. And when I tell you what happened, John, I asked him what it was like to release a film and not have that instant recognition. And I didn't think he'd heard me. And he was obviously of an age, and I was going to commit the cardinal sin of re-asking the question again. And he had heard me, and he said so quietly, it's lonely. It's incredibly lonely. And my heart dropped. This was Nick Rowe telling me how horrible it was to release a film and not get the acclaim that you'd hoped you were going to get. And I remember walking out and I thought, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to find out what filmmakers love him, and I'm going to ask them, would they contribute to The Man That Fell to Earth book? So I did. I found out that, the likes of Terry Gilliam loved him. Sam Taylor Johnson loved him, and I wrote away to them, Kevin MacDonald, and one of them was a producer, Sandy Leverson, and he spoke about Nick, working with Nick on performance. Nick was a lovely guy. And when I presented them with their books as a thank you for The Man Fell to Earth, Sandy and I started talking about performance. Could we replicate? Could we do something similar? And he had this treasure trove of imagery, so I went down to see it, and it took an age to get it all digitalized, but it was well worth it. There's some tremendous artifacts in there, and I said, I'd love to do it, but I want to continue the sort of same journey. You're on board. I can go back to Nick. I want to see if Mick Jagger and James Fox have come on board. I wrote away and they both said yes. And which was remarkable. Because I think maybe they said yes because the film was held back for 2 years. So consequently, there wasn't a lot of press around the film as there was nowadays. And they'd never really had an opportunity to explain themselves and perhaps drill down into a few details. Nick never liked talking about it because he and Donald had fallen out. The press sort of gave him credit for it in Donald's eye. Given Nick Rowe credit for performance. And that created a bit of rancor between the two of them. So Nick never liked talking about them. As I said, I didn't really understand that. And so I just ploughed ahead and asked him as many questions as I could get.
No, I mean, a bit of fortunate naivety goes a long way.
Yeah, I think sometimes, I think if you know too many rules, you're bound by those rules, and that creates hesitancy. And I don't really like that. Why can't I? I'm going to give it a go. I'm going to have a go. And I've done that in a lot of different things. I couldn't write a TV format, but I came up with a few ideas, and I wrote some TV formats, and we sold them. And the TV shows got made. And well, okay. Yeah, I went along to some meetings where I wanted to walk out because there's so many university graduates telling me that the shows were rubbish, and none of them had shows off the ground. I had. And it's the same with the books. Well, these books have been my lifeblood as I've been growing up. Why couldn't I see if I could write some books?
I mean, I think Nick Rogue's one of my favourite directors. I just find him. And earlier you mentioned the sort of punk spirit, and performance is really on the sort of knife edge between punk and the 60s. Yeah. You know, it's like with Chaz, the James Fox gangster character, you've got this real punkish aggression and everything. And then you have Turner, the Mick Jagger character, representing the 60s in its glorious excess and decadence. What appealed to you about the film? What was it? Do you remember like the first time you saw it?
Yeah, I do. I went along to see The Hit, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. It just blew me away, The Hit. So I went away to read as much as I could about The Hit and different interviews, and I kept seeing performance being referenced as an influence on the film. And then I found a cinema in London. I can't remember which one, but I remember it was pretty sleazy. And I shut along to watch it, and it as I hoped it would, it just blew me away. It was like two films gelled together. I mean, the first half, you could see some influences in that first half. And now going forward, you still can. When James Fox, when he smells the lawyer, you never smell anybody like that. And he said he wanted to get into the skin of what playing a chap would be. And you could smell that coming out. And then obviously the soundtrack, I remember walking along the high street afterwards, heard nothing like the soundtrack. And this is 20 years later, 15, 20 years later. That's what I wanted to try and achieve with the performance book, to that energy, and what that brought to me is hopefully trying to bring that across in the book. To hear James talking about it, and to find somebody like Billy Murray, who'd started out in his career working on the film, and to hear all these great stories about the likes of Bindon. I mean, these guys were real hoods. There's a great story in the book that Billy Murray told me. He didn't want to go out one night, and Bindon was saying, "No, you got to come out. And he went out for one drink because he wanted to take his career seriously. The Krays had put him through drama school. He felt he owed it to the Krays to make a career, a life in movie, whereas Bindon was sort of this wild card. So he went out. The following day they were on set, and Bindon's come piling up to him with a matchbox, shaking the matchbox. And he said, "Yeah, Billy, you want to know what's in this?" And he said, "I don't really, John, I don't really." He said, "Yes, you do. You want to know what's in this?" And we said, "Well, what's in it?" He said, "Well, ask Jimbo," which is James Fox. And what's in the matchbox then, James? He said, and Bindon had got into a fight and bitten off someone's finger and put it in the matchbox. And that was the night. That was that night. And when somebody like James Fox, who's this lovely, privately educated young guy who'd had all this lovely hilly hair, and he transformed himself into a chap. And I asked James as well, because the rumour was that he'd been out on a couple of gigs with the guys in the evenings, and he didn't allude to that too much, but apparently he did. He went out to a few of the chaps' excursions in the evenings just to get a flavour of it. And boy, that menace doesn't exude it. It's just, I found that just remarkable. And then when Sandy told me that the first choice for it was Marlon Brando, and they'd had meetings with Marlon in his hotel suite, and he was going to play an American gangster on the lam, and that sort of got pushed aside. That made it even more interesting. Here was a different story. Imagine how the film could have been made with Marlon Brando. It's just bizarre.
Yeah, and Tuesday Weld as well. You bring up that she broke an ankle of why she was going to play the Anita character.
It's just one of these fortuitous things, isn't it? Because now you just see that trio, and it is Anita, Mick, and James, and you couldn't imagine anybody else playing those roles.
It's like Tom Selleck as Indiana Jones.
Yes. They went in with this. Nick told me that they've gone into the film with a silly idea that Donald was going to look after the actors and Nick was going to take care of all the aesthetics and the cinematography. That would be in his background. And instantly those fields were melded into one and all became one. They realised that wasn't going to work. But I mean, just two directors on a film, you just can't. I mean, what we had? Guys and Dolls. Not Guys and Dolls. West Side Story, that was famously had two, but they fell out. It's just, I don't think they work. You need an auteur at the front, don't you? And Donald didn't have a great career thereafter, whereas Nick did, and that's sort of non-linear, what Nick became famous for. That's why Performance got sort of marked as a Nick Rogue film, which didn't sit well with Donald Cammell.
Yeah, I mean, it's understandable because if I watch Performance and Man Fell to Earth and Walkabout, back to back, I don't feel that there's a different creative voice there. It feels like all the same creative voice, even as diverse as those films are. Oh, I should just mention Chaps, just for listeners who are not au fait with sort of South London gangstas. Is a word that I didn't actually know it until I read your book, that this is a something that the gangsters themselves would refer to themselves as chaps.
Yes. Yeah, made men as they are in America. Yeah, but chaps in London sells.
Wise guys, and in fact, I've just done an interview with Glenn Kenny for Made Men. His making
that's
of
right. Yes.
Goodfellas. In a sense, this sort of convergence with the life of crime and the muse, the inspiration for the story, and the people telling the story itself, it sort of seems to be all one with this kind of slightly punkish aesthetic of let's film this on location, let's do this without the studio really knowing too much about it, and let's just get it on. There's a sort of like, going back to what we said earlier, it's a DIY aesthetic, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. And then bizarrely, they didn't release the film for 2 years. And I interviewed the studio head, and Ken Hyman, and he said, no, I wasn't averse to taking risks. He'd helped Lee to get off the ground. He said, but this just wasn't where I wanted to take the studio at that time. So they sat on it for 2 years. And when I asked Mick that question, he said, well, what did they make? What did they not look at the script? And they literally didn't. All they saw was Mick Jagger, Rolling Stones album. Boom, and they saw that avenue. And at the time, London was sort of the epicenter of these 60s style films. And they thought they were getting a Hard Day's Night with a Rolling Stones soundtrack. I mean, could you think of anything further from a Hard Day's Night than Performance?
It's the same, but they thought Blade Runner was going to be Star Wars, didn't they? They thought, we got Han Solo being a detective. What could possibly go wrong? The idea that they don't read the script, I think, is fairly widely acknowledged. You would think they would, but also I feel that watching Performance and Rogue's films generally, the idea that there was this sort of time of British filmmakers like Rogue and Ken Russell that were really pushing the boundaries of what you could do. I mean, from another point of view, I'm not surprised they didn't release it. You know what I mean? It's not an easy film to sell.
No. And in the event that the Rolling Stones album never materialized, they had one song with Mick. So that never materialized, and it's not a gangster film. It's not a rock opera style film, is it? It's where do we send to it? Borghese and amalgamated identities. It's just a cluster, isn't it? It could only ever been dreamt up and written in the 60s. Stroke 70s, but it's got that 60s vibe to it, and it could only ever have been dreamt up then. It is just bizarre. It works.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be honest, I watched a lot of those films from the 60s which were supposed to be capturing the zeitgeist, and I mean, most of them are kind of unwatchable now. If you watch something like Candy or they're just those Peter Sellers comedies that were Magic Christian and stuff like that, they're just unwatchable. They're just boring, really dull.
Yes, we went on a little bit of a promo tour with the book and had quite a few screenings and talks and Q&As, and God, does it still work now? And different audiences. Some of my friends hadn't seen it, and they came along, and so they were watching it for the first time, and it was wonderful afterwards to look at their faces. And, I know, you don't have to tell me. They were like, "What the bloody hell have we just seen?" And it's wonderful to see that push. I don't think there's sort of filmmakers like Nick anymore. I mean, one of the reasons that I've ended up working on the Trainspotting book was because Irving Welsh had written a play with Dean Kavanagh on two East End gangsters auditioning for the film Performance, and it was being shown at the Edinburgh Festival. So I quickly messaged a chum of mine, Ken, who produced Phil. I said, "You couldn't introduce me to Irving Welsh, could you? I'm just about to release Performance, and he's doing this play." He said, "Yeah, sure, man, I'll set it up." Urban and I spoke, and he said, let's shoot up to Edinburgh to see the play. So I flew up there to see the play. We got on really well, and we'd carried on emailing and messaging each other during the interim period. And I said, come on, 25th anniversary of Train Spotting. Could you introduce me to Danny in the big, large format book? And Danny's response was, the guy's done a book about performance. What's not to like? Set up me. And I went along to see Danny, and it was hard initially to get him to talk about Train Spotting because all he wanted to talk about was Nick. Absolutely loves Nick Rogue. I mean, and you can see that in his films.
Oh yeah, I think there's definitely sort of like a legacy that has gone from performance into British cinema and beyond. I mean, I think Jonathan Glazer, Under the Skin, and Sexy Beast, are really roguish, if I could say. I mean, Sexy Beast with performance and Under the Skin with The Man Who Fell to Earth. I think they're really, I mean, the influence is really evident. Also, the point of sort of Mick Jagger being this being his first film role as well, and this was really the beginning of sort of pop stars going into movies. I mean, you'd had Elvis and you'd had Frank Sinatra, but this new generation doing sort of serious movies, not being like Elvis in a cowboy hat, Elvis as a racing driver, but actually playing something of a sort of more serious examination of what being a rock star was. Because Turner is a weird distillation of Jagger and other stuff, isn't he?
Yeah, you had a bit of Keith Richards in there, you had a bit of Jones in there.
No, how does he sort of view it now? Because you talked to him for the book. So
yes, I did, and he mentioned those two, but he also mentioned that he put a bit of Donald Campbell in there, and he said, and ultimately, you're playing a little bit of a heightened version of yourself. By the time the film was released, the Rolling Stones had sort of moved away from being one of the great beat combos to one of the, if not the biggest rock group in the world. And he'd taken on that sort of persona of Turner. If you look at the pictures of when he started performance, he was still the sort of the 60s beat pop, if that's a term, pop star. And he turned himself into the biggest rock star in the world has ever seen, with bits of Turner into him. His hair had got darker, it got longer. So you could definitely see a little bit of the Turner influence in the Rolling Stones going forward. I mean, Keith apparently came down to the set, wouldn't come on, and wrote some of the great Stones songs because of his fear of Anita Pallenberg that he'd taken from Brian Jones, was now in bed with his writing partner, Mick Jagger. And I asked Mick how method were the love scenes, and he was like, I'll let you do your research. And that was as my poor Mick Jagger impersonation, but that was about as far as he'd dive into it. I interviewed a couple of the guys at Tex, the camera operator, and I asked them how method it was, and they said that was full on. It was what it was. It was real. Him and Nick were taking it in turns to take the camera underneath the bedclothes to film Mick and Anita, and they said it was just as there was two camps. There was a Peter Young, the 2 times Oscar-winning set decorator. He said that if the cool camp was down in the basement, and in the Tex, the camera people were sort of up there, but the cool camp was where you wanted to be. Right. And some of the guys, some of the chaps would come down, and Mick had offered them a toot. And they wouldn't have anything to do with that. No drugs. You didn't do drugs in them days in the chap world. But Mick was down there, and that was where Anita's sort of drug problem sort of started, really, during that period.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And they sort of ran wild from then on. So let's move on to the Deer Hunter, because this is a book and a film that had some controversy as well in its day. Not the book, but the film had some controversy as well in its day. How did you decide? How did you think? Oh, I'm going to do the Deer Hunter next?
Yeah, well, that was the sort of first idea, really, and it all came about, as I said, from the producers, and their stories were so full of rancor. So that was sort of the bigger story. And we had some great archives given to me. And then Bob's encouragement behind the project and brought on Meryl Streep and Chris Walken. I'd already got to John Savage and Rutana Alder. And there was just 2 camps, John. There was the text and the studio and the producers absolutely hated, and it's not too strong a word, absolutely hated Michael Cimino. The actors absolutely loved him. So there was definitely 2 camps there, because the actors were allowed that freedom that Michael Cimino gave them. They described it, so not my words, it's sort of Napoleonic tendencies of Cimino. It was a small guy, small in stature, but large in volatility. It doubled in budget. It was a $7 million film that escalated to $15 million. Michael Dealey could see the money pouring out, so he'd initially put John Peveril on He then pulled John Peveril and sent Barry Spikins over to try and stop the money that was pouring out of their little studio. There was an hour and a half of a wedding before they even hit Vietnam. I mean, you just couldn't add. It doesn't make any sense. But now, and Michael Dealey still doesn't think it makes any sense, which always baffled me. The guy won a Best Picture Oscar. You'd think that afterwards you see, I hated Cimino. I still don't like him. But boy, did he deliver the goods on the film. So there was that controversy from that side, and then there was the controversy that Cimino had lied and said that he was a Vietnam vet when he wasn't. There was the whole Tet Offensive, and he flicked that in the film that made the Viet Cong look like the barbaric people. So there was that. Jane Fonda famously came out against it. She also had her own Vietnam film at the time, Coming Home. Famously, she came out against it and never hadn't seen it. And to this day, I don't think she's ever seen it.
Right.
So because of the right-wing tendencies of the film. So there was all that flavour, all that was going on whilst I was writing the film and discovering more about it. Naively again, it didn't detract from the film to me. I still think it's a wonderful film. I think Bob's performance in it is stunning, and Chris Walken is just stunning.
In a sense, Cimino's career was that sort of Heaven's Gate, Deer Hunter, both huge films, both expensive, both going way over budget, but one just happens to hit that zeitgeist at the right moment, and the other one's a big Western that nobody wants.
He delivered a film on time, on budget. The star was happy in Thunderbolt and Lightfoot. Clint Eastwood was more than happy. So he had that going into the Deer Hunter. So there was nothing to really cause any suspicions that it was anything other than he purported to be. He claimed he'd written the script. What in my writing and investigation, I found out that he'd actually co-written it. But then further into the investigation, Joanne Corelli, who was Michael's sort of gatekeeper, for want of a horrible description, she opened up his archives and she showed me that he did in fact write the synopsis before he'd even met his co-writer. So there's loads of things that I unearthed from that, but there was no getting away from the fact that Michael Dealey took exception to the fact that Cimino, in his way, wheedled his way into getting a producer's credit alongside a writing credit and alongside a director's credit. So that rankled. But before the Deer Hunter had even won the Oscars, Joanne Corelli had taken Heaven's Gate to United Artists, and they could see that this film, Deer Hunter, it just blew them away. So they knew this guy was going to be hot. So they offered him a yes to Heaven's Gate. He offered it to Barry Spikins, and Barry Spikins turned it down. And then the film then wins all those Oscars, and him 2 Oscars. So he was literally the hottest kid on the block. And yeah, brilliant. Let's just give him Heaven's Gate. Fast forward to Raging Bull, my next book. The reason that was made and helped get made was because the studio was so concentrated on Heaven's Gate that Raging Bull managed to slip under the radar. No one even come to the set. It was never previewed because of Heaven's Gate. So for me, there's this sort of yin and yang thing going on. Heaven's Gate keeps popping up in the stories. He was, when I asked Bob the question, he said that he could have handled his success better. And that's something we see in Hollywood, that the sort of quick bloom success, it's a really hard thing to do and keep a lid on. You look at some of the great actors and people that perhaps you and I admired over the years. Lots of them, you mentioned Harrison Ford and Blade Runner. His career took age to kick off, didn't it? It really did. It wasn't, he was fixing a house up, and George Lucas famously gave him the carpenter the role in Star Wars. I think sometimes when you get it too quick, and that's perhaps what happened to Cimino. I mean, I haven't seen it, but Steven Soderbergh did a recut of Heaven's Gate, and apparently that's meant to be really good. And I think that will be really evaluated now, Heaven's Gate, and seen as not being the debacle that it was. I mean, people like, I got Jeff Bridges to, the book was being skewed a little bit, John, initially, to being a sort of anti-Michael Cimino diatribe. And I'd read about that too often. There's so much rubbish spoken about Michael Cimino. I didn't want my book, let somebody else go and write another book. I didn't want my book to be this sort of anti-Cimino thing going on. I wanted it to be about the Deer Hunter. In the event, I took some of that away from some of the tech guys that told me. But before I'd taken it away, I got in touch with Jeff Bridges to come on board, because I knew that Jeff loved Michael, to see if he'd talk to me. And it ended up being the afterward to the book. And it's... Oh man, I absolutely loved doing that. It was the fondness that he had mirrored Bob, John Savage, Chris Walken, mirrored their memories of working with Michael Cimino. They absolutely loved him.
It's so funny that in a way that you could have had the double director for something like Heaven's Gate or Deer Hunter, that he would be great with the actors and let somebody else go and deal with the crew and the more technical side, you know.
Yeah, that would have been great, wouldn't it? Yes, yeah. If he had a Nick Rogue beside him.
Moving on to Raging Bull, I mean, one of the things that I'm conscious of with Raging Bull is that you've got Scorsese sort of coming off quite a bad. He's coming off New York, and a fairly low point in his career. Also, I think health-wise, he wasn't particularly well. No. And Raging Bull, as you describe in the book, was really De Niro's pet project, wasn't it?
Yes, yeah. I think that's why there wasn't a moment of hesitancy from Bob when I said I was going for it, and he said yes, because it was something that he really, really felt passionate about. And I think at the top of this, you know, we spent, I think it was 6 seconds shy of 2.5 hours going over the manuscript just on one Zoom call alone, just working out, not censoring me, because he said that. Okay, right. Is that how Marty remembered that? And Joe said that. Okay. And then Bob would give me a little bit more because of how they remembered. And it really was his passion project. He wouldn't let it go. I mean, he went away to make Deer Hunter, and the first person he called on was Marty to say, look, Marty, I'm going to go away to make Deer Hunter. This is not going to rock the boat for our plans for Raging Bull, is it? But Marty, when I said that to Marty, he said, I still wasn't interested. I had my own problems to deal with, which were coke, partying. He hated sports of any kind. When he said that when they went to St. Martin in the Caribbean, you know, he was just, what? He never set foot on the beach. Bob would be out there every morning running. He took a chin-up bar with him. He was turning himself into a middleweight champion. And Marty said the only island I'd ever been to was Manhattan. I didn't want to go to any Caribbean, any beach. I hated it. Absolutely hated it. And that's where those wonderful pictures from Gloria Norris come from. They pushed him on the beach so he could go back, and they wanted to show Erwin Winkler that this is what we've been doing. We've been partying, which was nothing of the sort. They ended up rewriting Schroeder's script.
It's such a bizarre movie in the, as you were saying, the studio's not paying much attention to it. They're looking at something like Rocky as the sort of template, and you get this black and white sort of examination of male angst and insecurity instead of a boxing movie, and a brilliant boxing movie at the same time.
It's very much like The Godfather, isn't it? Marlon Brando, you think Godfather, you think of Marlon Brando. I think he was only on screen for a small portion of the film, wasn't it? I don't have the exact minutes beside me, but I know it wasn't long.
It'll be 10, 15 minutes.
Yeah,
at
least.
Yeah,
and then that's the same with the boxing in Raging Bull. It's 10 minutes of boxing. He told me that Marty told me that he told Norman Mailer that he wasn't going to have any boxing in the film. He said that was the state of my mind. That's where I was at the time, making a film about Jake LaMotta, and I'm not going to show any boxing. It just didn't interest me. Now it's incomprehensible, isn't it, John? Those boxing scenes are the greatest scenes of any sport, I think, in any film. It just took you inside the ring. He referenced James Wong and the famous cinematographer that he was on roller skates doing his, and what they done, they lengthened the ring, and you really do feel like you're inside there boxing with Bob. And another thing that Bob done, he told me, was that he had his boxing bag in the ring. So he'd literally be working out on that, working up a sweat. As soon as Marty shouted action, he'd move into camera and he'd be swathed in sweat, worked up, ready to go. When I went to his archives, there's a huge canvas, a Deer Hunter canvas. I wanted to get a picture of it just to see if it would work in the book. And as I was coming back down the steps, I saw the punch bag, and I looked at the archive and I said, is it? He said, yeah. I said, come on. And he let me have a little punch on it. And that was the punch bag, that Jake LaMotta's Bob's punch bag.
Wow. That's also the beginning of that sort of method acting, immersion in a role and physically changing your body, which nowadays has almost become, something not necessarily common. Not everybody does it, but we've seen Christian Bale do it. We've seen Daniel Day-Lewis do it. We've seen Joaquin Phoenix do it in Joker. But I can't. Maybe you can correct me, but I can't remember many people doing it before the De Niro one, especially the gaining weight. Loads of actors, of course, get into shape for a picture, but the gaining weight was really extraordinary at the time, and even today, it's like unrecognizable.
Yeah, he is. Yeah, and that's what I wanted to put into the book. That picture, there's a picture of Bob as Travis Bickle. So now you see him, this sinewy frame. So I wanted to show the reader that. So you've got Travis Bickle, and then you've got Jake LaMotta, this beautiful frame that most guys would absolutely die for, a frame like Bob's, and to look as as fit as that, and then to put your body through what Bob did, to go to France for 4 months. Initially, I'd read that he'd gone to Italy and France, and that wasn't the case. Bob told me, no, I wish I had gone to Italy because I could have eaten more. Whereas in France, the food was so rich, I could only eat one big meal a day because it was just so rich. Whereas if I'd gone to Italy, I could have ate more.
Yeah.
And he said, I had to feel what it was like, out of breath, my thighs chafing, the sweat. I had to feel what that was like. And there's another great bit in the book that Marty told me that Owen Winkler said that it was the only argument he's ever had with Bob in all their years of friendship at the weight game. And The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp is one of the great films, isn't it? And Marty said, look, I'm friendly with Michael Powell. Why don't we ask Michael about, how they did it in there? The fat suit. No, I'm not wearing a fat suit. Just have a chat with Michael. So they had a dinner party. Isabella was there. I think Cartel was there. A few people were there. And early on in the meal, Michael Powell says to Marty, well, when's Robert De Niro turning up? He's there. He's sitting next to you. He sat next to you for the early part of the evening. And he said, and that's why Bob is such a great actor. You don't even know he's in the room, and then he transforms.
Right, absolutely.
There was even talk of filming the film during the day and then making it as a play in the evening, but Bob said that would have gone down the fat suit. And I just did not want to wear a fat suit.
Right. I guess it's not for everyone. You shouldn't have to feel like doing that as a commitment, but it does stand out as one of those performances, and it's so physically it's so interesting.
Yeah, I think so. I think with Gary Oldman wore the fat suit for the Churchill portrayal. And I think that's a bit different. Yeah, it's a bit, because he was playing a character who we all know looks like that. I think what Bob wanted to show was the character in free fall. And the only way he could do that is to show just how out of shape he was. The first time he'd ever saw Jake LaMotta in the flesh was prior to sort of Raging Bull coming onto into his vision as a film. He'd seen him working as a bouncer outside of a club, and he thought, that's Jake LaMotta. And he said instantly, I thought, God, look how out of shape he was. That's interesting, which is just how Bob's mind works. It's amazing when you sit there chatting away to him, and he's so humble. He never looks on it like that. And you can see me shaking my head when we've spoken. To me, it's just remarkable that his attention to detail I just think he's just my hero, John. Just his cinematic hero.
I read an interview with Daniel Day-Lewis about this sort of, why do you go to this extent and everything? And he was saying, because I'm really curious. So if somebody says you're going to play a tailor, I'm like, oh, brilliant! I'll find. I've always wanted to know how to make clothes, and it's sort of. He was downplaying it, but I think that's that level of curiosity in that moment in De Niro's career goes all the way through his performances. He's just constantly researching the character and doing as much as he can to give as convincing a performance as possible. You've got Trainspotting coming up. When's that?
Yes, that's almost finished. Right. We're hoping that will be out in the summer. I meet up with Andrew McDonald the week after next just to go over different parts of the archive. I just did a couple of interviews today with some of the Empire team at the time, because they really championed the film. I've got just to follow up with both Ewans and Robert Carlyle just on a couple of things. But yeah, I'm virtually there. And then evenings are spent back into the world of Robert De Niro with Taxi Driver.
Right, and when is that due?
Well, I'm hoping that we might be able to, with a fair wind on time-wise, we might be able to get that out for the end of the year.
Taxi Driver's such an amazing film.
Yes, it is. Yeah, it is. And it still works. He's still astonished. He was working on 1900 at the time, and went down to the American Air Base, started talking to people from the district of Travis Bickle, and came back and started driving a cab. And I was talking to Marty about it actually on one of our Raging Bull chats, and he said it was true that a guy did get in Bob's cab. And he'd already won the Oscar for The Godfather, and said to him, oh, bloody hell, Bob, things are that bad of you. No, I'm doing this research. And no, Bob, you don't have to be embarrassed to me. And gave him a tip, a healthy tip.
It was Jake LaMotta.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but they earn no money for these films, John. Absolutely not a penny. I've interviewed Michael Phillips, the producer of Taxi Driver, and they interviewed a guy last night, Phil Goldfarb, who's the executive producer on behalf of Columbia. And these guys were doing it for next to nothing. Bob could have a small fortune after The Godfather. Yeah. He was so committed to the stories that he and Marty wanted to make. And that to me is just really intriguing, to dive into those worlds. These guys are artists, and to me, it's just now I'm in there. I really want to make sure that we look at these films and we honour them. And then Travis Bickle and the performance of Travis Bickle and the performance of Robert De Niro's Travis Bickle, should I say, is one that I can't wait to dive into. It's I've already got a plethora of material and been messaging Bob different things. It's going to be another great time.
Are you going to get contact with all the other cast members and everything you've got access to?
I've written away to them all. Yes, I've had a couple come back and say yes already. And then we'll see. Yeah, if hopefully with Bob's encouragement, they come on board. I think once he shows them what we've done with Raging Bull and with Deer Hunter, you can see that I'm not after the salacious gossip. I'm not after anything other than the film.
The making of films in that era, especially, seems to be something of an adventure in itself. Anyway, it seems to be less corporate and much more. There's much more spontaneity and it's kind of more risk. Do you think that's true?
No, I do. And it's bizarre because we talked about performance made away from studio pressure. The pressure came afterwards. Raging Bull made away from studio pressure. The pressure came afterwards. Deer Hunter made in Thailand away from studio pressure. The pressure came afterwards. Taxi Driver made in New York away from studio pressure, but that pressure was coming. I learned some really, really interesting details from the two producers that I've interviewed already, and they both lied. Basically, they knew the film was never going to get made for the budget they were giving it to, so they had to lie. But it was, I think it was originally $700,000, went up to $900,000, then 1.3, and it came in at 1.7. 1.7 million for Taxi Driver. Just forget it. It's just one of the all-time classic films, and they made it for that money. It's just phenomenal. But then Michael Phillips, absolutely thoroughly enjoyed chatting to him and getting to know him over the last few weeks. What a story. He was working in the money market, married Julia Phillips. Julia Phillips had just started working in the film industry in New York. She'd got friendly with an actor called Tony Bill. Tony Bill used to visit them in New York when he visited New York. And he said, there's a huge opportunity in Hollywood because all the guys are coming out of film school and they can't get an interview with a director or studio. Why don't we hang our shingle out and see if we can attract them? So they pulled their money, which come to the grand total of $3,500, pulled their money. Tony went back to Hollywood and hung their shingle out. First person through the door was this young guy who started pitching him a story. He said, no, hang on, I want to tape it. Taped it, he said, because I want to send it to my partners in New York. So the young writer now thinks, wow, these guys are huge players. They've got offices in New York. So he starts pitching this story. They really love it. And they say to him, well, can you actually write? And he said, yeah, I can. You can have a look at my theses, my school theses. So they looked at that, they loved it, and they optioned that. So they optioned two things. The school theses, they got off the ground. And within 2 weeks, Donald Sutherland and Jane Fonda were starring in it, called Steelyard Blues. It happened to bomb. But in the interim time, Julia Phillips and Michael Phillips started renting this house on the beach next to Brian De Palma. Brian De Palma's playing chess with this young writer, Paul Schrader, gave him the script to Taxi Driver. Brian said, well, I don't know for me, but I tell him, Michael Phillips might be up for this. Walked down the beach, gave it to Michael Phillips. Michael Phillips said it just hit him like a thunderbolt. He said, had to have it, so he optioned that. In that interim time, this young writer, David Ward, the film that he pitched was The Sting. They then won the Oscar for The Sting Best Picture. This is from a guy that had never stepped foot on a film set until a couple of years previous. They won the Best Picture Oscar. Their fourth film was a film that the young filmmaker couldn't get off the ground, Close Encounters of the Third Kind. I mean, if that doesn't show you can have a go at things in life, then nothing.
Build it and they will go.
I mean, unbelievable, isn't it? What a story. I mean, Michael could see how energized I was after our chat. You and I have loved films for all of our life. It's just, they're the stories I absolutely love.
Absolutely
love.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing. And I think your books really capture that. They really capture the energy that goes behind making the films, and I love the arguments.
Thank you, John. That means a lot.
Yeah, no, it's. I mean, I know Deer Hunter and Raging Bull and Performance really well, and I was learning loads of new stuff in there, and that's.
Oh, thank you, John. That's really very kind.
No, it's amazing. It's amazing. I wanted to ask you, though, about your inspiration as well as a recommendation of a film book that has inspired you in the past.
Oh, right. Oh my word, these are the questions you hate. I'm looking at a pile of books sitting in front of me, and all of them I take to a desert island. The Big Goodbye, Chinatown, Stan Weston's recent one. Five Came Back, another recent one, Mark Harris, beautiful. A. Scott Bird's Goldwyn, it's just one of the great biographies, as is Kevin Brownlow's David Lean's. The absolute stunning biography. Frank Capra's the name above the title. Montgomery Clift, Patricia Bosworth. 2. I'm going to have 2, but 1 I'm going to have to make a decision on. 2 would be Conversations with Wilder, with Cameron Crowe, because I absolutely love Billy Wilder. And Cameron Crowe's book I thought was just stunning. And it's not something I normally, the question answer thing I wanted to get away from in my books. But I absolutely love Cameron's book. And one day I will meet him and write him an email and just say how much I love his book. But perhaps the book that had the biggest, I absolutely love, and I've read so many times. I've been to see the stage play. I used to do a lot of running when I was younger and listen to it on my headphones. There's this one, The Kid Stays in the Picture, Robert Evans. Absolutely love it. I love his voice. I love his story. I love the fact that he had that punk attitude. I love the fact that before he'd even produced a film, he was the head of a film studio. I just love everything about Robert Evans. Everything that was wrong or right. I just think The Kid Stays in the Picture to me. When who needs facts when you've got myths and made up stories like that? Absolutely a treasure trove. I'm sure most of the stories aren't true, but boy, do they make a great book and a great read.
Okay, so that was my conversation with Jay Glennie, the author of the Making of Raging Bull book, as well as the making of Performance, The Man Who Fell to Earth, The Deer Hunter, and soon to be released Trainspotting, as well as at the end of the year, hopefully, his Taxi Driver book. So all those to look forward to. As you can tell, these are beautiful books. If you go to his site, Coattail Publications, you'll be able to see for yourself. And Jay has access to the most important people influencing the making of those films, filmmakers and stars alike. So thanks very much for listening. If you like the episode, please remember to like, subscribe, and spread the word generally. You can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Jonty, DRJONTY. Thanks also to Elliot Atkins for the music and Ali Howard for the cover art. Until next week, please take care.